Now, nature of sociology, again, something that I will not really go into the details. Scientific approach employ karti hai, examine social relationships, focusing on how individuals interact with groups, explore diversity, investigate social institutions. So this is something that's kind of not that's so important. Scope of sociology, I just want to, because there are these questions every now and then, delimit the scope of sociology. This is 2022. Explain how sociology has emerged as a distinct discipline based on rationality and scientific temper. So let's go look at this further. The scope of sociology, mind you, extremely wide, right? Its range is basically the whole social life, the entire social life. So everything pretty much comes within the scope of sociology. Nothing, in some senses, is outside sociology's ambit. As a discipline, it tries to look at how human behavior is shaped by social structures, social institutions, social categories. So that's what it tries to do, but the range is incredibly wide. Now, in the beginning, the scope of sociology was established by presenting it as a scientific discipline. Remember positivism. Remember Auguste Comte's insistence that sociology was a scientific study of society. But later on, so basically the idea was it objectively investigated, it was scientific, it was unbiased, and so on. While discussing its scope, there were three things that were referred to, and this is important. It was called, sociology was encyclopedic, number one. The other, it was called evolutionary, and then it was called scientific. So remember this: encyclopedic, evolutionary, and scientific. What else? Then it says, now this is a value addition. You will not find it anywhere. According to Anthony Giddens, he points out that there are these three things that can always be referred to when we are talking about scope of sociology. It makes us aware of cultural differences. It makes us more understanding in that sense. It provides practical help in assessing the results of policy initiatives. So that's another important pointer. And sociology can provide us with much needed self-realization or self-understanding, self-enlightenment, meaning increased self-understanding. So as you do sociology, you become more and more aware of who you are. So that's Anthony Giddens. In order to understand the scope of sociology, what do? You have to understand in what ways is it related to other social sciences. So that's how you begin to make sense of scope of sociology. So from here we get into another important theme of Unit 1, which is sociology and other social sciences. Sociology's comparison with other social sciences. Now, this is a fairly tricky domain. Remember, in very often what happens is, not very often, but once in a while what they do is in UPSC, in a 10 marker, they say, how is sociology related to other social sciences? Now, that can be a very tricky thing to do. So my suggestion, my submission is, and of course students do this, so I've learned from the students, my submission is that you simply, what you can always do is with a very brief introduction, then you can always have a certain diagram. So you write sociology, then arrow anthropology, another arrow economics, another arrow political science, another arrow psychology, another arrow history, and then another arrow from sociology to anthropology, then an arrow. It tells you just 2 lines, very short, in what ways are they different from each other. Then similarly in relation to political science, psychology, history, etc., etc. So this is the best possible way in which you can tackle a 10 marker when you have to really write a lot. So you just do this diagrammatic thing, you situate the core differences that are there, and then maybe one paragraph to kind of sum up the core ideas, and then towards the conclusion you can simply point out that how these disciplines started on very different notes as separate knowledge domains, but over the years, over the decades, over time, what has happened is that they have come together, and now in this age of interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity, etc., they go together. But before that, again, anticipated 3 things: multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity. So we need to be aware of this. You never know, there could be a question on just what is multidisciplinarity. So the word is used, the word is already in use in PYQs, but as such they have not really asked a question on multidisciplinarity. So you have information here: multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity. So you can always go through these. Now from the viewpoint, so these are the questions. Again, some of the question 2021, 2017, 2014, 2013. Let's see how we manage this. So I will not really go into too many details because I don't want to kind of contribute to information overload. You already have your material, you already have your sources, you already have your notes prepared. I don't want to kind of really push you hard on this, but I just want to bring to your notice some of the pointers that are truly, of great value. So if you're looking at sociology and other social sciences, this is the mantra, right? This is something that will help us out. So there are three things that we need to keep in mind. Keep in mind three most forceful and most important points for differences and similarities, always, whichever other social science we are talking about. Remember, how was the relationship in the beginning and how did it evolve over time? That's something that we need to keep in mind. Sociology, anthropology, how was it in the beginning? How did it evolve? Sociology, political science, how was it in the beginning? How did it evolve, right? So this is something that we need to keep in mind. Always remember names of a few scholars and their works. So you have to have both kinds of references. One is how a scholar makes sure that, this particular work is not sociological, psychological. And then works that also bring sociology and psychology together. So this is the blueprint. These are the things that you need to keep in mind every time you're attempting a sociology and other social science question. Okay, now sociology and political science. Let's just quickly look at this. Specifically, there are these questions. I think most recently there was a question on sociology and political science. Sociology attends to all societies irrespective of the nature of the political system. Political science attends to only those societies that have formal and organized political setups. That's an important difference. Sociology looks at all societies. Political science looks at only those setups that have specific kinds of formal political systems. Point number two, in sociology, we have subfields like political sociology that look at political power, state, political behavior, etc. But in political science, we do not have anything of that sort, right? Point number three, traditional political science has remained somewhat distanced from political behavior. It is only recently that political scientists have started studying political behavior. So, and then you can always refer to political sociologists within sociology. For example, Weber was an iconic political sociologist. Samuel Martin Lipset was a great political sociologist. Wilfredo Pareto was a great political sociologist. C. Wright Mills. So you have ample number of references here. Then you straight away refer to political sociology, which is in between political science and sociology. It's a branch in sociology that studies power of a specific kind, right? Authority and social basis of power. So this is something that it's interested in. For example, Max Weber, C. Wright Mills, Samuel Martin Lipset, and all of that. So I have already, but there is also, just to conclude, Bottomore points out that political scientists are not very happy with sociology people doing political science or sociology people studying stuff that is to do with political science. Two reasons. They are unhappy. Two reasons. Number one, they think that they are being swallowed, that the entire discipline is taken over by another discipline. So that's one concern that they have, and that's a very genuine concern. The other reason behind their unhappiness, political scientists' unhappiness, is they are not really certain about the actual credibility of what a sociologist is doing on subject matter of political science, right? They are not very certain about the validity of that work. So that's about sociology and political science. Let's look at sociology and psychology. Very quickly again, how is sociological approach to human actions different from psychological approach? This is 2014. Now, pay attention to this, because very often, in fact, invariably, I've seen students simply don't refer to great thinkers. Durkheim. What does Durkheim say? Durkheim made a clear distinction between the phenomena studied by psychology and sociology. The man was committed to underlining this distinction again and again. Sociology was to study social facts. He points it out very clearly in Rules of Sociological Method. Whereas psychology was to look into psychological facts. And Durkheim was very clear that only when we get into social facts, we are actually studying sociologically. If we are attributing anything to the individual, then we are getting into individual facts or psychological facts, and that study is not valid for Durkheim. In his celebrated study of suicide, another example. So I gave you one example from Rules of Sociological Method, 1895. Another example is from suicide, which is 1897. What does he say? There is a difference, he points out. There's a categorical distinction he makes between incidents of suicide, which he calls a psychological dimension, and the rate of suicide, which he calls a sociological dimension. So remember this. Point number 3, renowned British anthropologist Radcliffe Brown. Remember, Radcliffe Brown is hyphenated. Invariably, students write Radcliffe space Brown. No, it's actually hyphenated, just like Levi Strauss, the jeans brand. Radcliffe Brown argued that sociology and psychology actually studied two very different levels of reality, different systems. He points out sociology studies the social system, whereas psychology studies the mental system. And this is what he points. So this is clearly about psychology, sociology being very different from each other. Parsons, another example. Remember ecology of sociology when he talked about these interlocked, interacting action systems, behavioral organism, personality system, social system, cultural system. That's ecology of sociology, what he calls it. In relation to ecology of sociology, within that theory of social systems, he points out, Parsons, that the personality system is studied by psychology, whereas the social system is studied by sociology. And you can use exactly the same thing for sociology and anthropology. The social system is studied by sociology, whereas the cultural system is studied by anthropology. So keep this in mind. But there have also, so this was all differences, but there have also been great attempts, wonderful attempts, commendable attempts in favor of a closer association between the two disciplines, or bringing them together. How's that? G.S. Mead's celebrated work, Mind, Self and Society. It's a classic work that brings sociology and psychology together. Social psychology is, of course, a subdiscipline in sociology that tells us about the overlaps between, or the coming together of, sociology and psychology. Now, sociology and anthropology. What's there? Compare and contrast sociology with anthropology, 2013. What all do we have here? Now, sociology's origins are to be traced back to philosophy of history, political philosophy, social survey. Anthropology's origins are to be found in biology. So in terms of origins, so I'm not going to talk about a range of things, but I will definitely share a few pointers that I believe you will not find, in all likelihood, you will not find elsewhere. So my job here is to not only revise with you, help you with PYQs, but also, give you as much of value addition as I can. Anthropology substantially dwells on functionalism, whereas sociology remains historically oriented. Of course, sociology also dwells on functionalism, but sociology has more of an allegiance to history. So in other words, sociology is more historical than anthropology. That's a brilliant point. Take a note of it, right? In a country like India, for example, the distinction between the two has little meaning. We know very well. If you look at the 1950s, 60s works, sociology, social anthropology, anthropology, it's all together. These are all working together. But what needs to be pointed out is that in Indian universities, again, an interesting example, anthropology and sociology are not only taught in two different departments, they are actually taught in two different faculties. Anthropology usually is in faculty of science. If you do an anthropology master's, you don't do an MA, you do an MSc in anthropology. That is at least in Delhi University and Calcutta University, right? So that's another difference. Even when sociology and anthropology are studying the same thing, they still do it differently. So basically, anthropology, the former is more into, sociology will be more into patterns. So studying theme A. Let's say both anthropology and sociology are studying theme A. Sociology is studying patterns, whereas anthropology is getting into the details. So the anthropological account will be much more detailed, whereas the sociological account will be about drawing connections, about patterns, recurrences, etc. Sociology and economics, very quickly. Durkheim. I have not come across a single student who uses this, and it's a stellar argument. Durkheim made a very clear distinction between sociology and economics through his first work, Division of Labor in Society, because he pointed out that in sociology, we need to understand division of labor differently. We cannot carry on with, or we cannot simply submit to the economists' understanding of division of labor, right? The understanding that was coming from the likes of Adam Smith, sorry. So this is, again, a classic distinction. Then you have Andre Bethe. Again, I don't think people refer to this. There's an entire article that he wrote for the Economic and Political Weekly in the year 2000, quite some time back. Economics and Sociology, an essay on approach and method. And remember, Andre Bethe was at Delhi School of Economics. He was in the sociology department, and he had many of his friends in the economics department, people like Amartya Sen and others. And they would always, have discussions and debates on a range of things, on inequality, on ranking, on poverty, etc. So he points out two things. While economists have focused on the distribution of income, sociologists have attended to what we call ranking of occupations. So sociologists are more interested into ranking of occupations. Economists are more interested in income, right? Distribution of income. Another very important point, economists prefer to write about inequality, whereas sociologists actually pay more attention to what he calls stratification, right? So these are pointers that we might want to keep in mind. Then there is a special subfield in sociology, which is called economic sociology, undertakes sociological examination of economic phenomena. There are extremely famous sociological works concerned with the general features of economic systems. Take the example of Marx, the iconic thinker of the 19th century. If you look at Marx's Capital, 3 volumes, this is coming together of economics and sociology. Look at Weber's Protestant Ethic and Spirit of Capitalism. That's also a wonderful example of economics and sociology coming together as two disciplines. There have also been attempts at consciously adopting sociological approach to economic problems. So there is F. Simeon who has done this, using sociology to make sense of economic problems. So in Marxism, sociology and economics get linked with each other. We know very well. Then again, Weber's another work, the theory of economic and social organization, brings the two together. Swedish sociologist Richard Swedberg has put together a celebrated work called Economics and Sociology that makes a case for more collaboration, more interaction between the two disciplines and redrawing the boundaries between the two. So this is as good as it can be for economics and sociology. Sociology history. Let's see what we have here. Importance of historicizing in sociology. You cannot have sociology without historicizing. Think of all the thinkers. Think of Marx, think of Weber, think of Durkheim. They all historicize, meaning they all talk about what we are, not straight away, but they try and figure out how did we become who we are, right? So they look at the process. So there are these interesting references, but just few somewhat different but equally important references. E.P. Thompson's work, The Making of the English Working Class, is a classic example of a great... Now, Thompson was a historian, but this is an example of a historian working with a sociological sensibility. So that's E.P. Thompson. Ambedkar, nobody refers to this particular great man. Ambedkar's numerous writings on caste particularly, they are of course historical, but they are written with extraordinary sociological. These are works that bring together historical sociological sensibility. Peter Burke's, this is a very important reference, Sociology and History in 1980. And Peter Burke points out that both the disciplines can always complement each other. They can both help each other. So each discipline can free the other from its own kind of parochialism. So what sociology can do is it can give historians a more acute sense of structure, and history can give sociologists a more acute sense of change. So this is something that we can always look at. Domains such as social history, right? Historical sociology inform us about significant convergence between the two disciplines. Subaltern history as well. You can always refer to subaltern history. Sociology and history do not remain too far from each other. They kind of come together. Sociology and philosophy. Not asked, but you never know. So again, very quickly, both the disciplines come together when we look into the theme of self and society. Symbolic interactionism, they kind of come together. Psychology, sociology, philosophy, sociology. In interactionism as well. So in this symbolic interactionism, they essentially come together. But both the disciplines actually vary. How do they vary? If you're thinking about philosophy, when philosophy inquires about norms, let's take an example. It does not look at norms in practice. It looks at norms as an ideal. So it is engaging with the ideal version of norms. But when sociology engages with norms, it does not talk about norms as an ideal. It looks at how norms are there on the ground. What is the practice around norms? So sociology is concerned with the fact of norms, whereas philosophy is concerned with the idea of norms. So that's an important point. Then you have Durkheim, who in his reflections on social fact made a categorical distinction between the philosophical and the sociological. So Durkheim was very clear that this armchair philosophizing is not going to do. It will not help, because philosophers just sit and they sort of think, they indulge, they take, they're very much interested in this abstract thinking. But Durkheim is very clear that sociologists cannot afford to just sit, cannot be an armchair theorist. Sociology has to be in the field, has to directly observe the social fact. So he makes that distinction between philosophy and sociology. And in fact, you can always refer to Marx, who famously, one of his theses in Thesis on Feuerbach says, philosophers have interpreted the world in different ways. The deal, however, is to change it. So Marx is also of the opinion that philosophers simply do the easy work. They just sit and they theorize and they contemplate and they come up with all kinds of abstract ideas. But the actual job is on the ground. You have to really get to the people and do what is needed, something that philosophers don't do. They just sit back and interpret in a very relaxed